Hello, everybody, and welcome to General Psychology. I am your instructor, Tanisha Stewart, and I wanted to do this very brief video just to answer a few questions that I received in my emails. So, a couple of people had questions about how to do discussion one, whether there was a word limit, different kind of technical guidelines. And I also had other questions you know, about the different perspectives that it asks about. So first, we're just going to take a look at the instructions for the assignment. I'm going to go over the basic formatting, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'm going to go into some information about the different perspectives that psychologists are underneath that you can actually use for your discussion assignment. So let me share my screen really quickly. And I'm going to go to Blackboard first so that you will be able to see the discussion assignment. So I see that a few of you have already participated. So we got about 10 people that already participated. That's great. So under the chapter one discussion, the instructions are that there's seven different current perspectives in psychology that are presented in chapter one. We got the cognitive, psychodynamic, evolutionary, behavioral genetics, neuroscience, behavioral, and social cultural. Which of these seven perspectives resonates with you the most and why? Please provide a meaningful response that demonstrates critical thought and analysis of the perspective you chose and comment on to classmates. So we'll just stop right here. So, as far as like technical guidelines, for me, I'm not very deeply concerned about how many words you use in your response, as long as you are demonstrating that you're showing critical thought, that you are answering the question thoroughly, that is fine with me. And when you reply to your classmates, as long as you are showing that as long as you are showing evidence that you are using critical thought when you are replying to your classmates, pointing out something they said, pointing out something that resonated with you, and then adding to the discussion, as long as it's something that adds to the discussion and shows that you actually have reflected upon whatever it is that they said, that is fine. So saying something like good job, that's not really going to cut it. But if you say something meaningful and say something that shows that you actually reflected on what they wrote, then that's fine with me. So there's no word limit for either one of these. I'm just looking more for content rather than I'm looking for quality rather than quantity, if that's the best way to say it. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over here and I want to share my screen again and I want to go to a slideshow, um, just going into the perspectives. So this slideshow is reduced, so it doesn't cover the entire chapter. It just gives a snapshot. And what I did was I'm just going to focus on those perspectives that are contained within the discussion one. So chapter one, the evolution of psychological science. All right. So first things first, the chapter itself is laid out pretty in a pretty chronological sequence. It goes into how psychology actually starts, the way back history with the philosophers. We got people like Aristotle, Plato, people like that, Rene Descartes, et cetera, et cetera. And then that is considered to be like the way back history where the ideas and the concepts first started to be applied and written about. But then we have the official history of psychology that starts in the late 1800s with the inception of the first psychology laboratory that happened in Germany, and I believe it was like 1869. So that was the official history in the late 1800s. Then we go into like some of the early thoughts that helped to shape the modern day perspectives. We got something called psychoanalysis, which we're going to talk about very shortly. Then we're going to go into behaviorism, which we're also going to talk about, resistance to behaviorism because it kind of took over for a long period of time. Then we're going to talk about something called the cognitive revolution, and then what is going on to this day. So that is pretty much how the chapter is structured and how it was pretty much outlined. So let's go on to the next slide. All right. So, first things first, the very first perspective that we're going to talk about today is by a man named Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud is considered to be one of the most notorious psychologists of all times for a number of different reasons. He was an extremely brilliant man, but he also had a lot of controversy surrounding him, a lot of different things going on with him. You could delve into his history to see some of the things that were speculated about him and some of the controversies he had. But nevertheless, he was considered to be a groundbreaking figure to the point where he helped shape the field of psychology for a very significant amount of time. So, his theory or the major theory that he helped to purport was something called psychoanalytic theory. So psychoanalytic theory, which essentially focused on childhood experiences. It also focused on something called the unconscious mind. So if you have ever heard somebody say you did that unconsciously or you did that as part of your subconscious, if you ever heard either one of those two terms, the original term was the unconscious mind, but in more modern day times, people kind of shifted it and they started calling it subconscious, and now they are both considered to be somewhat interchangeable. But if you heard either one of those terms, he actually came up with that terminology. So he actually coined that phrase, the unconscious mind, subconscious mind, however you want to say it. But what is the unconscious mind? What is the subconscious mind? According to Freud, the unconscious mind is the part of our mind that is playing the biggest part in whatever it is that we're doing and whatever issue it is that we're facing. However, it is the part that we are least aware of. So it's the part that has the most effect on our behavior, but it's the part that we are least aware of. And his form of therapy and understanding the mind was trying to delve into the unconscious, trying to tap into the unconscious, trying to ask questions, delve into a person's past experiences, delve into their childhood, delve into whatever experiences they may have had in their past that may be promoting whatever is happening in their current circumstances. So he believed that if you went through something in childhood, essentially, that is going to carry on into your adulthood, and it's going to show itself in your behaviors. It's going to show itself in your interactions, the way that you think, the way that you act toward other people, et cetera, et cetera. So it was very largely focused on the unconscious mind, childhood experiences. Also, in his form of therapy, he used something called psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is another one of those catchphrases that we've heard in modern times, where people say like, don't try to psychoanalyze me. Why are you trying to psychoanalyze me? Essentially, what psychoanalysis involved was pretty much exactly what I described, as far as like looking into your childhood experiences, asking questions, probing deep, et cetera, et cetera. But he also used a number of other techniques when he was trying to work with his clients or his patients. One of them was something called hypnosis, where hypnosis was actually considered to be very controversial for a number of different reasons. But the main reason why it was controversial for him was because of the fact that he discovered that although some of his patients seemed to be able to be hypnotized, most of them did not. So he's like, all right, I got to go back to the drawing board here. Some of these people, I'm able to hypnotize them. I'm able to delve into their psyche. I'm able to figure out what's going on in their unconscious, but a lot of them, I'm not. So what he did instead of hypnosis for a lot of his patients, he started segueing into something called free association. And free association was essentially them laying down on a couch in his office, and they would just lay there. He would be sitting somewhere in the room, and he would just let them talk and just let them say whatever it was that came to their mind. And he did this because he felt like one of two things was going to happen. Either A, there was going to be a subject that they constantly kept talking about, or B, there was going to be a subject that they constantly avoided. And either one of those is probably the root of their issue in his mind. So that was what he believed. And that pretty much formed the basis for psychoanalytic theory. And then it kind of went on from there. So then we have something called behaviorism. So a lot of people focused on what Freud talked about. A lot of people were interested in the mind, trying to delve into it, trying to break it down, trying to understand it in all possible ways. But then when the behaviorist rose up, they're like, wait a minute now. Why are we so focused on the mind? We can't even see the mind. We don't even know if the mind exists. Let's look at what we can see instead of what we can't see. So they believed that your behavior was something that was physical, something that was tangible, something that was observable, something that was measurable, and therefore something that was controllable. Whereas your mind is something that we don't even really know that we can truly understand because people are so fickle, et cetera, et cetera. We may not be able to do it much with your mind according to their thoughts, but we could do a lot with their behaviors. So the very first person who kind of introduced the concept of behaviorism was a man named Ivan Pavlov. He actually was not a psychologist originally. He was actually a physiologist and he worked with dogs. So if you have ever heard of Pavlov and his dogs, et cetera, classical conditioning, he was the person who kind of spearheaded that. And the way that he did this was kind of accidental. So he was working in his laboratory with his dogs. And one day he noticed that the person who came to feed the dogs started to salivate. So he's like, why are they salivating when they see this person who's coming to feed them? Like, what's going on here? So then he dug a little bit deeper and he's like, I wonder if they're salivating because they're expecting food, which makes sense because if you, the person who, same person come every single day, they come at the same time, they come through the same door, et cetera, you develop an expectation. So he's like, all right, let me test this theory. Let me see if I can cause them to salivate off of something else, basically. So what he did was he started ringing a bell, giving the dog food, ringing the bell, giving the dog food. Eventually, voila, What ended up happening was the dog started to salivate every time they heard that bell. So he developed something called classical conditioning, which was essentially creating a new reflex in these dogs. So somehow, some way, they had developed a reflex when they saw that person who was coming to bring them food, but he was able to transfer that reflex and create a new reflex when he rang the bell. And then he tried different things as well. So a metronome, he tried a bunch of different things, and he found that he was able to use a few different mechanisms to create this effect in these dogs. So from that, other people became interested in this, and they're like, "All right, you did that with dogs. But can we do that with humans though?" So a man named John B. Watson, he was like, "I believe we can do this with humans. And I believe that this will open the door to us understanding human behavior even more because I'm not convinced we can understand the mind. I'm not convinced we can study the mind. I am convinced though that we can study behavior." So he believed that every single thing that we do on this earth is something that is controlled by our environment. And he set out to prove this with a study that he did with his own version of classical conditioning. So you may have heard of the little Albert study. If you have, he is the person who actually was behind that study. And what he did was he got a child. I believe he was about 1 year old, if I'm not mistaken. Convinced his mother to bring him to the laboratory and kind of lied to her about the what the real purpose of the study was. I think he told her he was doing something with like memory and emotions and childhood or something. So he kind of basically lied when he when he told her what the study was going to be about. So he brought her baby into the laboratory unsuspecting, and what they did was they first introduced a bunch of different animals to the child, and the baby wasn't afraid of any of the animals. The baby was having a good old time, petting the animals, having a great time. So he's like, "All right, let me pick one of these animals to make this child afraid of. How about the rat?" So he's like, "All right, I'm gonna pick the rat. And what I'm gonna do is the rat right now is neutral. The rat right now is something where the child does not have a problem with the rat. He could play with the rat, he could be with or without the rat. It has no bearing upon him. But what I want to do is I want to teach this child to develop an emotion toward this rat. And the emotion that I'm going to choose is fear." Now, a lot of people might be like, "Okay, that's kind of twisted." And admittedly, it kind of is kind of twisted. I have no idea why torture and fear are the first thing that come to people's minds, but hey, tomato, tomato. This is where we are. So he's like, "All right, how can I get this baby to be afraid of fear? Or how can I get this baby to be afraid of this rat? What I could do is I could get something that the kid is automatically afraid of and then cause him to add that thing to the rat repeatedly, and then that will make the kid afraid of the rat." So what he did was he had this hammer that he banged against this symbol basically. So he banged the hammer behind the baby's head against the symbol repeatedly whenever the rat was in the room. So now the child is forming this association between this loud, scary banging sound and this rat. So eventually, what ended up happening, just like with the dogs, where you ring the bell, give them food, ring the bell, give them food, ring the bell, give them food. Eventually, they start salivating off the sound of the bell. With poor little Albert, what ended up happening was if you bang that symbol over and over again, whenever the rat is in the room, now he's afraid of the rat. But his fear extended beyond the rat, and he became afraid of everything that was furry and everything that was white. And then his mother took him out of the laboratory, and there's been speculations about whatever happened to him ever since. After that, John B. Watson felt like he had arrived, so to speak. But then, just like with Freud, there was a whole bunch of scandals with him. So he ended up getting fired and moving into advertising. And now we have basically been manipulated by him ever since. So any form of commercial, advertisement, billboard, you could thank Watson for that. And he learned how to manipulate human emotions using behaviorism techniques and using classical conditioning techniques. So he kind of went wild with it and kept going on his way. All right, so then we have a man named B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner wasn't really into people like that. So he's like, "Yeah, you can keep the people because people come with scandal. I don't want any scandals. I just want to do my experiments. I just want to do I want to develop my theories, but I don't necessarily want to deal with people like that because people are difficult to control. There's too much scandal. I don't have time." So what he decided to work with was rats and pigeons. He's like, "Hey, rat, pigeon, human, we're all the same, right?" So what he decided to do was develop his own form of behaviorism called operant conditioning. So classical conditioning was, ringing a bell, giving a dog food, or teaching an association from one stimulus and another. With B.F. Skinner, he said, "All right, learning could happen the other way around as well. So sometimes we can do something, and then the result that we get from whatever we did, that can change our behavior as well." So you could change your behavior by having a stimulus that leads to a response, but you can also change your behavior by you doing something, facing a consequence, and then either stopping or doing that thing again. So he came up with the concept of reinforcements and punishment. Um, and basically, his idea behind it is that if you are rewarded for a certain behavior, you're probably going to do it again. And if you are punished for a certain behavior, you're probably going to stop. So he started working with those rats and pigeons. And as you can imagine, he was successful in his theory. So if you look at the slide here, you see the picture there of the rat inside his little Skinner box, which is what he called it. And those what the rat is standing on are actually electrical rungs, so they can actually send an electrical shock to the rat, which is not very nice or pleasant. Those electrical shocks were used as punishment for the rat. When he wanted the rat to stop a behavior, what he would do was he would shock him, basically. And if he wanted the rat to continue a behavior, he would dispense food in through that little hole that you see there on the picture as well. So he started manipulating these rats, manipulating these pigeons, and long story short, he was very, very successful. And his theory became something called operant conditioning, where if you are rewarded for a behavior, you will probably continue it. If you are punished for a behavior, you will probably stop. So after this, ideas like John Watson and B.F. Skinner, they kind of took over the entire field of psychology for like 50 years straight, to the point where nobody was interested in studying the mind anymore. Nobody cared about the mind anymore. Nobody barely even believed in the mind anymore. And anybody who tried to study the mind, they were just like ignored, basically. But then other researchers started to rise up, like John Piaget. And they were like, wait a minute now, you may not believe that we can study the mind, but we can. We just have to develop techniques to do it. And you may not believe that the mind exists, but obviously the mind has to exist in order for two people to have individual reactions to different experiences. So like it doesn't make sense that two different people can be in the same environment but have two completely different outcomes if there wasn't some other mechanism at work. So it's got to be something going on with our minds. So Jean Piaget was one of those people that tried to delve into the mind. And what he did with his studies was he delved into children. He was very interested in how children's minds were developed and how your cognitive understanding develops as you are shaped in your trajectory. So essentially, he believed that your brain dictates your cognitive development. So our brain goes through several growth spurts throughout our life. So we have our first growth spurt during the first year of life in our brain. Then we have another one in early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, and then our final one in our mid 20s. And he believed that as you go through each one of those brain growth spurts, you actually are also going through a cognitive growth spurt in the way that you think and understand the world. So he believes that you are constantly reshaping your understanding and thinking and understanding in different ways with each growth spurt that your brain experiences. So the processes that are behind this are something called schemas, assimilation, and accommodation. So, a schema is simply just a concept that we come up with when we are developing our understanding of the world. So, all of us have hundreds of thousands of different schemas that we have developed over the course of our lives. So, for example, we have a schema for family, where in our mind, if I say family, you're thinking of the people in your family, like the people you are close to, the people you are connected to, the people you're related to. Your concept of family has been developed since childhood. If I say school, you have another schema for school where you're thinking, okay, I go to Manchester Community College, so that's going to be my school. And or I graduated from X high school and that's my school. So you're going to have some kind of concept or schema for anything that you have experienced in your life. Assimilation and accommodation are the ways that we integrate knowledge and develop those schemas continually. So assimilation is when we encounter something that is similar to something that we have seen before, and what we end up doing is taking that information and just applying it to what we already know. So for example, if we learn that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and then we learn that 2 plus 3 equals 5. Like, okay, all right, I'm learning. I'm learning that, 2 plus 2 can equal 4, 2 plus 3 can equal 5. If I just keep adding and adding and adding all these numbers, I'm going to learn that I can also continue to add numbers. So, like, I'm just adding something to my knowledge. I'm adding more information to my knowledge. Another example would be like if your family grew up with a golden retriever and then you encounter a German shepherd, like, what the heck is that? And they're like, oh, that's another dog. You're like, oh, there's other dogs outside of golden retrievers? Yes, there are. So you're like, okay, I'll put that in my mental Rolodex. So now I understand that it's not just one type of dog that exists. There's multiple types of dogs. They all bark, they all have four legs, they all have some kind of fur associated with them. So dogs, there's different types of dogs. That's assimilation. Accommodation, on the other hand, is when you encounter something that kind of differs from what you initially knew about a certain thing. So, for example, going back to the adding, let's say that you're adding, but then somebody throws a division problem at you. Like, what the heck am I supposed to do here? We got the plus sign, but then we got this line and two dots. Like, I don't understand. So you're like, oh, there's other types of math that exist where addition is just you adding numbers together perpetually, but division is something completely different. Now you breaking numbers down. You ain't adding numbers no more. You're breaking them down now. Like, what the heck? I don't understand. I failed. But um it's just another way of understanding math. Just understanding that there's different forms of math, and the different forms of math do different things. So, another thing when it comes to accommodation, when it comes to animals, you could say that you got used to dogs. You're like, okay, golden retriever, we got German shepherds, we got different types of dogs. But then you stumble upon a squirrel. Like, okay, what's going on here? This doesn't bark like a dog. It has four legs, it has fur, but it doesn't even look like a dog. Like, what's going on here? Like, I don't understand. You're like, well, that's a different species and that's a different animal. So a squirrel and a dog are two different species, they're two different animals. You're like, oh, okay. So now you messed me up already with this addition and division thing. First I'm adding numbers up, now you got me breaking them down. And now here we go with a dog, but then now you got a squirrel. What's this world is just getting bigger and bigger. So assimilation and accommodation are the ways that we learn to construct our understanding of the world, and we do this perpetually, basically. All right. So then we have social psychology. So social psychology is developing an understanding of the world that is based on little bit of nature, a whole lot of nurture, but mostly our own interpretation of the things that we see around us. And in terms of our relationships with other people, like the way that we interpret our relationships with other people, the way that we interpret other people, the way that we interpret our own actions, our own reactions. So it's very, very heavily dependent on the environment for one, the social environment for two, and how we interpret that social environment. So, for example, if I'm in a classroom and everybody in the classroom raises their hand when they ask questions, I'm probably going to raise my hand when it's time to ask a question because that's what everybody else appears to be doing. On the flip side, if I'm in a classroom and everybody just kind of yells out their answers, why would I raise my hand? Everybody else is just yelling out their answers. So I'm just studying other people and I'm seeing what other people are doing and I'm responding accordingly, essentially. So social psychology is basically studying that. It's studying how people influence each other, how people are influenced by each other, and how those things interact with one another. All right. We got a few different researchers that have studied underneath social psychology. Two of the most notable ones are Solomon Ash and Gordon Allport. So Solomon Ash, he studied how people influence each other to make certain decisions. He studied something called conformity, where you may have heard of this study before, but he essentially had some lines on a screen, and he had people compare the length of the lines, and essentially they had to see which line matched another set of lines, essentially. And what he would do is he would have a group of people come in to participate in this, and all the people except one would be false participants, and it would be one true participant. He would have all the false participants give an obviously wrong answer, and he wanted to see what that true participant would do. Would they give the same wrong answer or would they stand their ground? Sadly, what he found was that a lot of people just gave the wrong answer, same as everybody else, because they felt pressure to conform to other people. So that was just one of the studies that he did. Gordon Allport, he studied another topic that is very, very sensitive in today's times. It has been sensitive for quite a while. But he studied things like stereotyping, prejudice, racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he showed like how those things can start, how those things continue, how they continue to progress, et cetera, et cetera. Long story short, people form prejudices based on stereotypes. So a stereotype is a belief that we have about a group of people that could be true or false, but is mainly based on either one experience or based on something that people commonly say about this group. So we have these stereotypes, which are could be positive or negative. You could have positive stereotypes as well as negative, but we have these stereotypes that exist, and then based on these stereotypes, we form an attitude, which is a prejudice, either toward or against that group. And then racism is a form of prejudice that is applied into behavior, and it involves a dominant group of a racial category, essentially oppressing a minority group of a racial category. That's essentially what racism is. And Gordon Allport was one of the people that opened the door to help study this and understand it and try to combat it. All right. So going back to cognitive psychology, we talked about Jean Piaget a few slides ago, and we talked about how he believed that children progress through different stages as their brain continues to uh, go through its growth spurts. But another person who focused on cognitive psychology was a man named Noam Chomsky, and essentially, he combated against behavioral theorists who believe that we should study only behavior because the behavior is all we can see. We don't even know if the mind exists. He's like, not so fast. It's clear that there's something going on mentally with people because of the fact that even when you look at children, all children are born with the ability for language. However, um, every form of language is not necessarily taught to a child. So there have been studies that have been done that have showed that some children will just kind of repeat what they hear other people say, but then oftentimes those same children will then generate new sentences and new phrases that they have not heard anybody say before. How the heck is that possible unless something's going on mentally that allows them to do that? So he was one of the people that kind of opened the door. All right, so then we got evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology actually has a few different start points. So one of the start points was with a man named Charles Darwin, which a lot of us may have heard of before. But Charles Darwin was the one who came up with the theory of evolution, which is why it's called evolutionary psychology. And then from that, William James, which was considered to be the first American psychologist, he kind of took Darwin's ideas about physical traits being passed on, and he kind of took that idea and applied it to behavioral traits. And he said, all right, I believe that our brain helps us to process the world and helps us to develop these behavioral traits that will help us to then adapt, thrive, and survive and reproduce in this world. So other people agree with that. And those people became the evolutionary psychologists that we see today. So they do this with animals, they do this with humans, and essentially what they try to focus on is how humans or animals mate and how certain mating behaviors help a species to survive. They also focus on certain behaviors that do help people to survive. Like for instance, we've had a few different revolutions in the way that we understand how to thrive in the world that we live in. So for example, we used to have like agricultural type societies, and you had to know how to farm, you had to know how to when to farm, how to do certain things, how to grow to certain plants, how to what conditions to put them under, et cetera, in order to be successful and survive as a family. Then when we shifted into like factory, you had to be somebody who was able to work. You had to be somebody that was able to pick up some kind of trade, et cetera, et cetera. And then now we're kind of shifting into a technological type age where you got to know how to use some form of AI, some form of social media, some form of something related to the internet in order to be able to survive and thrive. So evolutionary psychologists would study all of those things and see how they affect us, and then how and what's also they're going to make projections for what could potentially happen in the future. All right. So then we got neuroscience. Neuroscience is a branch of biological psychology. And it has a few different names. So we got behavioral genetics, we got neuroscience, we got biological psychology, we got physiological psychology. If you think of any of those terms, they all fall underneath the similar umbrella. So but neuroscience in and of itself is the study of the brain and how it affects how it affects your behavior, how it affects your genetics, how it affects a bunch of different things. So, two major researchers who focus on the brain and how it can have an effect on us are Paul Broca and Carl Lashley. Long story short, Paul Broca discovered a part of the brain that, if it was damaged, it would affect our ability to understand or produce language. And then Carl Lashley, he discovered when he was trying to figure out what part of the brain was associated with certain behaviors, he found that there is not one single part of the brain that is associated with certain behaviors. Even though some parts of the brain target certain things, all parts of the brain kind of work in conjunction with each other with everything that we do, which is kind of cool. All right, so then we got neuroscience, which is continuing this discussion. We got cognitive neuroscience and behavioral neuroscience. Cognitive neuroscience focuses on the relationship between the brain and the mind. So, how does the way that you think how does your brain affect the way that you think? Like, for instance, if you have too little dopamine being produced, is that going to affect the way that you see the world? If you have too high levels of serotonin, is that going to affect the way that you see the world, et cetera, et cetera? Then we got behavioral neuroscience, which focuses on how the brain can affect our behavior. So if a part of your brain is damaged, will that necessarily affect how you act and interact with other people, et cetera, et cetera? And then last but not least, we have cultural psychology. And cultural psychology focuses on how people within a culture can interact with one another based on their culture, as well as how people between different cultures can have an effect on each other based upon their cultures as well. So, for example, within the United States, we have a bunch of different subcultures. We have a bunch of different cultures that exist within the United States, but then we have an overarching culture that the United States itself has. So, if you ever heard of the phrase like the American dream, et cetera, where you have the white picket fence and 2.5 kids and the house on the hill, et cetera, that is part of the culture, quote unquote, of America. But then underneath the culture of America, we have several different subcultures. And there's countless ones. So we can have Hispanic subculture, we can have Black subculture, we can have Italian subculture, we can have a bunch of different subcultures that people within that subculture, they might have certain foods that they like to eat. They might have certain music that they like to dance to. They might have certain customs, certain values, certain religious practices, et cetera, et cetera. And it could really, really go deep, depending on what facet of culture that you were interested in studying. But cultural psychology, in and of itself, it just focuses on people within a culture as well as people between cultures and how they interact with one another. All right, so that was my brief snapshot. That wasn't quite so brief. This is probably like 45 minutes long. But that was my snapshot, and hopefully that helped. So when you going back to the assignment that you're supposed to do, so let me go back to Blackboard just to talk about the assignment again. All right, so essentially, out of all that we just said, just pick one of them seven and say this one resonates with me the most, and here's why. And then once you say all that, you're gonna look at your classmates and you're gonna say, all right, this one said this, that one said that. All right, I like what this one said, and I'm gonna take out a piece of what they said, and I'm gonna focus on that and add to the discussion. And then I'm gonna pick a second person and do the same exact thing. So that is how you do your discussion assignment. Hopefully this helps. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and we'll get the ball rolling. So hopefully you're having a great first week of classes.